Hi, my name is Penny Clark, and I was part of the team from Alluvium that undertook the Glenelg River Environmental Flow Study update. In this presentation, I will be talking through why we did this study, who was involved, what we did, what we found, and how the results from this study will be used. So why did we do this study? Well, this study was an update of the 2003 Environmental Flow Study. That was the first environmental flow study undertaken for the Glenelg River, and it was one of the first studies of its kind undertaken in Victoria. So a lot of things have changed since 2003, and this update brings the environmental flow recommendations for the Glenelg River in line with the current practice around the state. An environmental flow study is important because it provides the scientific basis for the delivery of environmental flows. It provides the basis for how the Glenelg environmental entitlement can be used, and it gives us confidence that the entitlement is being used effectively to achieve the desired environmental outcomes. The environmental flow study is also important to help us identify what the elements of the Glenelg River flow regime are, which are important to maintain the environmental condition of the river. So flows in the Glenelg River have changed over time, and in this environmental flows update, we talk about three different flow conditions in the river, being the natural flow regime, the unimpacted flow regime, and the current flow regime. The natural flow refers to the patterns of flow in the river prior to any European settlement. So this means the flows that would still be occurring now if we didn't have Rocklands Reservoir or any diversions or extractions from the river, and we didn't have any land clearing or catchment dams. Because it's very difficult to quantify what the natural flow regime would have been, hydrologists approximate it using the historic flow records that we do have of inflows to dams and known extractions. This approximation is referred to as the unimpacted conditions, and it's important to note that this doesn't actually take into account any of the impacts of land clearing. The current flow regime is based on the recent records of flow in the river. In the case of the Glenelg River, we have about 30 to 40 years of flow records, and we use that to analyse the flow regime, the current flow regime. In the graph on this slide, we can compare the unimpacted and current flow regimes downstream of Rocklands. So the unimpacted flow regime is represented by the blue line, and the current flow regime represented by the green line. This shows that on 80% of days, the flow in the river is 10 megalitres a day or higher under current conditions. You can get the green line there. However, under unimpacted conditions, the flow would only have been 1.5 megalitres per day this frequently. So low flows in the river, which dominate the flow regime, are now much higher than what they would have been under the unimpacted and presumably natural conditions. At the other end of the spectrum, we can see using this 100 megalitre a day line that under unimpacted conditions 100 megalitres a day would have been exceeded on 40% of days. So that's here. However, under the current flow regime 100 megalitres a day is only exceeded on 20% of days. So an environmental flow study doesn't try to recreate the entire natural flow regime or even unimpacted flow regime, but it will identify the aspects of the regime which are important and need to be maintained in order to achieve the environmental objectives. So what has changed since 2003? Well, firstly, there's been an extended period of drought, which was only in its early stages in 2003, and this was followed by floods in 2010 and 2011. The droughts and floods have shown us the type of climatic conditions we might be likely to experience in the future, and have also shown us how the river responds to extended periods of dry. There's been a large amount of new monitoring data collected, particularly under the VEFMAP program. VEFMAP is an acronym for the Victorian Environmental Flows Monitoring and Assessment Program, and this program has collected data at a number of rivers across Victoria, including the Glenelg River, with the aim of evaluating the ecological response of the rivers to environmental flow deliveries. So using this new monitoring data, as well as the experience of droughts and floods, there's been a significant scientific advancement relating to environmental flows over the last decade. The Victorian flows method is the statewide approach used to determine environmental flow requirements. This method was developed in 2002, so the original Glenelg flow study was one of the first studies done using this method. Since then, most of the large rivers across Victoria have had environmental flow recommendations done using this method. In 2012, there was a review of the method, which resulted in some enhancements that we have been able to incorporate into this study. There have also been some new infrastructure developments in the Glenelg catchment that have changed the amount of environmental water that can be delivered. Who was involved? Glenelg Hopkins CMA partnered with Wimmera CMA for this project, so we also undertook a parallel study for the Wimmera system to update their environmental flow recommendations. We liaised with Bryce Morden at Glenelg Hopkins and Mark Toomey at Wimmera. Their role was to consult with their respective communities to identify what the priorities are for environmental watering. Alluvium coordinated the technical panel. Led by Amanda Willems, the technical panel comprised a group of scientists with specialist skills in the areas relevant to environmental flows in the Glenelg River. Professor Paul Boone was our vegetation specialist, so he was able to identify what flows are required to support the riverine and floodplain plants. Dr. Nick Bond was our fish specialist, whose role was to identify what flows are required to achieve the objectives for fish. Tim Dogue was our macroinvertebrate specialist. Macroinvertebrates are the bugs that live in water and are useful indicators of river health due to their role in the food chain. Tim was able to identify the flow requirements to maintain healthy and diverse macroinvertebrate communities. Dr. Dom Blackham is a fluvial geomorphologist, and his role on the team was to identify what flows are required to achieve the desired channel form, including what flows are required to support the sand management activities in the Glenelg River. Dr. Nick Marsh was the hydrologist, whose role involved analysing the current and unimpacted flow regime data to identify what attributes of the flow regime are important for achieving the environmental objectives. Also, once the technical panel had agreed on flow recommendations, Nick assessed the risks of achieving these based on the current flow regime. And I was the hydraulic engineer on the technical panel. My role was to run hydraulic models at a number of locations along the Glenelg River. These models were used to identify the flow depths, flow velocities that would be seen at those sites for a range of different flow volumes. There were two stages to this project. The first was the review stage, where the technical panel reviewed all the available data and the existing flow recommendations. We then had a day-long workshop with the CMAs and the technical panel to identify what the priority areas to update are. In the second stage, those priority areas were updated with new flow recommendations. In the review stage, 4 priority areas were identified to update. The first of these was the environmental objectives. In the 2003 study, the objectives were set by a technical panel. However, these should really represent the values of the local community, so updating the objectives was identified as a high priority for this study. Some priority reaches of the river were identified. I'll go into these in more detail later, but the selected reaches represent those which can be influenced by environmental releases from rocklands. A number of issues were identified in the models used to determine the ecological responses to flow in the 2003 study. These included the models used for sand movement, vegetation, and hydraulics. And the final priority is to recognise that the flow requirements may vary between drought years and wet years. The 2003 study recommended the same in-channel flows for all years. However, it is now recognised that the natural variability between different climatic years is important and should be reflected in environmental flow recommendations. To update the environmental flow objectives for the Glenelg River, the Glenelg Hopkins CMA collated these new objectives, which draw on the Regional Waterway Strategy and were cross-checked with the Glenelg River and Wetlands Advisory Group. The objectives covered 5 key areas. Firstly, for fish, the objective is to protect, maintain and where possible enhance populations of native fish. For vegetation, the objective is to maintain healthy and diverse mosaics of water-dependent vegetation. For macroinvertebrates, the goal is to achieve SEPP compliant communities. SEPP is the State Environmental Protection Policy, which sets a standard of macroinvertebrate communities for river health. For physical form, the identified objective was to improve and maintain channel diversity using channel forming flow. And the final objective was to maintain the platypus populations in the Glenelg River. Environmental flow studies always provide recommendations at a reach scale, and the previous study used 3 reaches, the first being from downstream of Rocklands Reservoir to the confluence with the Chetwynd River, the second being from Chetwynd River to Casterton, and the third being from Casterton to the estuary. During the review it was noted that releases from Rocklands can't have much influence on the flow downstream of Casterton due to in-stream losses and catchment inflows, and as a result this reach has not been included in this update. The updated study does include the first and second reaches. However, Reach 1 has been split into 2. Reach 1A represents the section of the river from Rocklands to 5 Mile Outlet, and Reach 1B represents the section from 5 Mile Outlet to Chetwynd River. This allows for different flow recommendations upstream and downstream of 5 Mile Outlet, and reflects the fact that water can be released from Rocklands either directly into the Glenelg River at the reservoir outlet, or it can be diverted via Tolondo Channel and released into the river at 5 Mile Outlet. We also look in this study at a new reach, Reach 0, which is from Mura Reservoir to Rocklands Reservoir, to identify the requirements for environmental flows between those 2 reservoirs. A tech panel field visit is an important element of an environmental flow study. It builds on all the information that's been collected during the literature and data review stages to clarify points of interest and identify features that may have been overlooked. It also provides an opportunity for the tech panel to discuss and resolve cross-disciplinary questions on site. In March this year, the tech panel visited the Glenelg River and over 2 days inspected a range of sites along the priority reaches. We didn't cover the full length of the river, but instead were guided by the CMA to representative sites along each reach. In order to identify the magnitude of environmental flow that's required to achieve the necessary flow depths or flow velocities in the river, we undertook some hydraulic modelling. We used 7 hydraulic models for this project, each of which was located at a representative site in one of the priority reaches. Each model covered a site of between 500 and 1500 metres in length and included 10 to 15 surveyed cross sections which picked up the ground surface within the stream channel and out on the floodplain. There was one site for Reach 1 which was located downstream of Fraser Swamp and upstream of Balmoral. This was a new hydraulic model created for this project. For Reach 1B we were able to use 3 existing hydraulic models which were created in 2008 as part of the VEFMAP program. Similarly for Reach 2 we were able to use another 3 existing models that were created in 2008. This is an example of one of the hydraulic models used in the project. This one's located at HARROW and it covers about a 1300 metre length of the river from just upstream of the town to just south of it. The figure on the left shows the 16 cross-section surveys that were used to build this model. These surveyed cross-sections picked up the ground levels of the channel and the floodplain. The profile on the right picks up the invert or the lowest point of each of the channel at each of these cross-sections. The right-hand side is the upstream end, so the first black dot you can see there on the right-hand side, this one here, represents cross-section 16. This is cross-section 15 all the way down to cross-section number 1. You can see in this particular one there's a 5 metre deep pool at the start of the model, and by the time we move our way down to the south of the model we're looking at much shallower pools. This slide shows an example of a cross-section in the HARROW model. The section is located in the upstream deep pool and it includes the main channel that my mouse is hovering over here and a floodplain out to one side only. These black dots represent all the points that were surveyed, and you can see these points are much further apart in the floodplain than they are across here in the channel. To show this a little better, we've zoomed in on the main channel in this second image down here below. So that's exactly the same survey data, but just with a different depth to width ratio. You can see that in the channel all these close survey points are really important when we're looking at identifying a low environmental flow. The results that we're showing on here are not really low flows. They're 100 megalitres a day and 1,000 megalitres a day. So the 100 megalitres a day is shown by the light blue shaded in area. This is the expected depth you'd be likely to see. We're able to interrogate the models to get the velocities associated with that. The line above that represents the depth of flow with 1,000 megalitres a day flow down the Glenelg River at HARROW. We're able to run all 7 of these models like this for a range of different flows, and we had these results available for us at a tech panel workshop, which was a day-long workshop. Each of the scientists were able to identify what their requirements were, and there was a great deal of discussion to determine what the what a uniform or an overall recommended flow would be. This discussion centered not just around the magnitude of flow, but also about what time of year that flow would need to occur, how long the flow would need to last for, how often it would need to happen, and whether there is any variation in drought years or wet years. Following the workshop where we identified all the environmental flow recommendations, a final set of updated environmental flow recommendations for the Glenelg River were made. There are 4 key things that have changed in the update. The first of these is around cease to flows. In the previous study, there was no recommendation for cease to flows. Under the current study, we still don't recommend cease to flows. However, it's acknowledged that they are likely to occur and that they can be permitted. And there's some guidance provided around how to restart flow after a cease to flow period in order to manage water quality risks. Some of the flow magnitudes that were recommended in the previous study have changed. These are a mix. Some of them are higher, some of them are lower than what they were previously. But overall, the total long-term volume of water that's required is less. The number and frequency of freshes has changed. Again, some of these are more frequent, some of them are less frequent. In general, the new study, the updated recommendations have more variation in what might be happening. And finally, big change is the seasonal variation. We now have different recommendations for a drought year, for a dry year, for an average year, or for a wet year. The updated environmental flow recommendations are presented for each reach in a table similar to the one on this slide. You can view all of these in the study report, which is on the CMA's website. However, I'd like to talk through this one just as an example. So this is the updated recommendations for reach 1A. Recommendations are made for 5 different components, which are listed in the left-hand column here. So we have recommendations for cease to flow, which is for periods when flow in the channel dries up, for base flow, which is the continuous low flow, which keeps the channel wet, freshes, which represent short increases in flow depth, bankful flow, which is flow up to the top of bank, and an overbank flow, which is flow getting out onto the floodplain. For each of these components, the details of what's required is provided in the left-hand columns here. And these 2 right-hand columns explain what objectives are achieved by each flow component, and also some notes on how the environmental flow recommendations should be used. So, for the cease to flow, we can see there are 2 different recommendations depending on the time of year. The December to May period we often talk about as the summer period, and June to November period as the winter period. We obviously have a flow magnitude recommended of 0 megalitres a day for a cease to flow. And the frequency I'll skip to here is as infrequently as possible. So that's in line with what I was saying earlier about there being no recommendation there's no recommendation for cease to flow, but these are some guidance if a cease to flow is to occur. Now, different recommendations are made depending on the conditions. So this is depending on whether it's a drought, dry, average or wet year. In a drought year, the recommendation is shown here that less than 145 days in total during that summer period, a cease to flow could be permitted. In a dry year, less than 125 total days during that summer could be cease to flow. And in either an average or a wet year, less than 110 days would be acceptable. Similar recommendations are made for the winter cease to flow period. For the base flow, we have a continuous flow recommended in summer of 10 megalitres a day and 60 megalitres a day in winter. The or natural requirement that's in here means that if the natural flows would have been less than 10 megalitres a day in summer or 60 megalitres a day in winter, then the lower flow will be sufficient. This flow is consistent under all conditions, regardless of whether it's a drought year or a wet year, and the flow is continuous other than the periods of cease to flow which may be permitted in between them. For freshes, we have a summer fresh of 60 megalitres a day and a winter fresh of 550 megalitres a day. Under all conditions, 2 summer freshes are required, and these should last for 2 days during drought, that's this one here, and 3 days in either dry, average or wet years. For the winter fresh, it's recommended that a 1 day, 1 fresh in a drought year occurs, but this builds up to 5 freshes in a wet period with a minimum duration of 5 days. For bankful flows, we recommend 1400 megalitres a day, and we recommend these only occur in dry, average and wet years, and it's 1 per year or natural, lasting from either 1 day, 3 days or 5 days. For overbank flows, 4000 megalitres a day is recommended in wet years only. We expect this would happen. Again, the 1 per period or natural. Some of the notes for these bankful and overbank flows are quite useful. Across here it talks about the frequency per decade that's required for inundation of certain species. So 2 to 3 times per decade for river redgum and 2 to 5 times per decade for tea tree. In the overbank, we also have 1 to 3 times per decade for black box. To see how the updated flow recommendations compare with the recommendations from the 2003 study, we can look at the graph on this slide. This graph represents a comparison for Reach 1A, but we have similar graphs in the report for the other reaches. So this graph shows the total annual volume of water required to meet the 2003 recommendations and compares with the total annual volume of water required to meet the updated recommendations. So if we start by looking at the light grey column of data here, this shows us that the total annual volume of water required to meet the 2003 recommendations was 36.6 gigalitres. And that's the same in a drought year, a dry year, an average year or a wet year. If we now look at the light green column of data, we can see the volume of water required to meet the updated recommendations. And we can see that for drought years, this is considerably less, only 5.4 gigalitres. In dry years, still less at 13.8 gigalitres. In average years, again less at 22.9 gigalitres. And only in wet years does this increase to 40.8 gigalitres. This graph also shows us a comparison of the shortfall for the 2 different sets of recommendations. The shortfall is the volume of water required on top of the current flow regime to achieve the environmental recommendations. So the median shortfall reported here is based on the historic flow in the Glenelg River at Fulham Bridge from 1972 to 2010. The dark grey column of data represents the median shortfall for the 2003 recommendations, and the dark green represents the median shortfall for the updated recommendations. We can see from this that there's very little of the existing flow regime that is achieving the recommendations, and the shortfall nearly equals the total recommended volumes in many years. This is particularly obvious in the 2003 recommendations in drought years. If we go across here, we can see that 32 gigalitres shortfall makes up almost the entirety of the 36.6 gigalitres that was required. The updated recommendations have reduced the shortfall in most cases. So again, if we look now at the drought years, we can see that the shortfall has been reduced to only 3.4 gigalitres out of the 5.4 gigalitres that's recommended. So this presentation's provided an overview of what we found in the Environmental Flow Study Update. How this information will be used is that the Glenelg CMA and the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, VIEW, will use the updated recommendations for their annual planning and prioritisation for environmental water deliveries. This year, in 2013-14, the deliveries have been based on the new recommendations for the first time. The ecological benefit of flow releases into the Glenelg River will continue to be monitored under the VEFMAP program. The CMA will also continue to undertake other catchment activities which support the environmental objectives, such as fencing, weed and exotic species control, and sand management. The updated flow recommendations are available on the Glenelg CMA website. These can be accessed and viewed for more detail.